level. Next level.
Second, and now everything else decided not to work. Okay, there we go. Hopefully all sorted now. Apologies about that, everyone. Can't actually blame anyone else for that one apart from myself. But welcome to this week's Monday Assembly. I'm quite some way behind, so I'm going to have to work very hard to catch up. But if you're new to these sessions, guys, basically we run the sessions with the rubber banding effect on, so it will keep the group together. Now, obviously you won't be able to see that from my screen. I'm so far behind. I will do my best to catch up. But guys, basically the point of the session is to get whatever you want out of it, okay? So you can ride as hard or as fast as you want. Use it as a recovery session and just chill, or you can head to the front of the group and give it the beans. Whatever you want, guys, okay? So just relax. We've got a fully coached session ahead of us. We're going to be talking about peak powers and how they interrelate with the training zones. Okay? This actually might not sound like the sexiest topic, but it's actually basically kind of the fundamentals of training. Okay, so it's actually a super important topic to cover. Now, the course we're riding today, I did want to ride the National Championships course, the British National Championships course, but I couldn't find a GPX for it, which is really annoying. So we're riding the New Forest Loop, which is one of the kind of popular magic road routes on Wahoo RGT. Okay, you can see it's pretty tame. There's nothing too major in it. A couple of little lits, but otherwise, you know, pretty regular. So, you know, necessarily, we've had a few really hilly routes recently, so I did think we should go for something reasonably relaxed today. Otherwise, I'll just get a load of abuse. But yeah, I hope you're well, guys. So just remember, these sessions are interactive. So, you know, for the guys that are on Zoom, feel free to unmute yourselves at any point, ask any questions. You can also use the Zoom chat if you don't feel comfortable unmuting yourself. Just so you know, guys, the guys that are on Zoom, your voices don't carry on to the live stream. Okay, it's just me that goes out onto the live stream. So don't be afraid. You're not going to be broadcast to anyone watching the live stream. Okay, so you can relax on that one. You can also, if you're watching the live stream and you're actually watching it live, you can comment in the comment section on whichever social media channel you're watching it on, and we'll pick up those comments too. Okay, so you can ask questions there. And then of course you've also got the RGT chat, which I've got up in front of me as well. So basically, at least 4 different ways you can get in touch and ask your questions. Okay, so as I say, we're talking about peak powers and training zones, how they interrelate and how you can use them. And we've talked about this kind of a few times in various guises, but I will explain why we decided to do it again, because I think it matters. Right, I need to stop. I need to do my best to try and catch up a little bit. I think the horse might have bolted on this one though, so I'm already about 600 meters behind, and it's being a black horse. Imagine you guys are absolutely flying. So might be a day for me just to chill out and boot around. One of the reasons the tech was a bit shambolic, well, actually the reason the tech was all a bit shambolic today, is I snuck out, had a bit of time to go do some hill reps on a local hill, and just left myself a bit time pressured. So lesson learned there for me. And for anybody that is new to these sessions, my name is Rich, by the way. I'm the head coach at RIAK Fitness. We're a coaching outfit. You want to know more about what we do, you'll see various things running in the adverts above me, but just head to our website, riak.fitness, and it's all covered there. And in particular, if you're interested in any of our coaching relationships, you can sign up for a free 15-minute coach consultation. So that's just a quick FYI, a quick plug, as is customary. But hopefully guys, you're all relaxed, all chilled. There's not really any structure to the session. We just ride the course together. Normally, when I'm not trying to catch up, I'll ride at about 2 watts per kilo. You have to ride a bit harder. I'm gonna give it sort of 5-10 minutes. See if I catch up. If not, I'll just pull the plug. Just chill out. Because really, it's more important I'm able to talk. Got a bit of a jittery RGT here, ceiling. Apologies for that, everyone. Let's see if I can just quickly do anything about that. Let's see what else we've got running. Right then, join up with my mate Hazan. Let's try and catch up. Okay. So probably let's get started with the talking, with the discussion for tonight's topic, shall we? Probably don't want to just hear me heavy breathing, moaning about my disorganisation. So we're talking peak powers, how they interrelate with kind of training zones. I would say probably training zones is something that people are generally more familiar with. They come in, 5 training zones, 7, 9, however many. And basically, when it comes to cycling in particular, they're a way of kind of just making sure you're working at the right intensity, essentially. Okay. So that's a very kind of quick overview of what training zones are, but probably the phraseology, the jargon that you're not that familiar with is peak powers. Now, because I find this one can be a bit of a tricky one to talk about, because they're actually called all kinds of things. So we call them peak powers, called critical powers, and on Wahoo's system, I can't remember what they're called on that. It's slightly different. I can't remember. But basically, what we're talking about here is kind of like your personal bests, your personal best power over different durations. Okay, so that's in a nutshell what we're talking about. I'll go into more depth, of course. But the reason we decided to talk about this is we have talked about peak powers, we have talked about training zones, FTP, on a number of occasions. But the reason I want to cover it again is because of Wahoo's acquisition of RGT. Okay, obviously that happened quite some weeks ago now, but as a result, kind of different training methodologies I think has gained a bit of increased importance, particularly for our customers, for our followers, for athletes, and then for you guys as well, riding on RGT, who have now access to these other kind of Wahoo related platforms. Just thought it'd be really useful to kind of bring things together a little bit, because I know for sure that it can all get very confusing as to kind of what all this stuff means. I'm really hoping you guys have some good questions for me today, because this stuff isn't straightforward. Well, it is, but there's a lot of jargon, and it's often just kind of scything your way through the jargon. That's half the battle. So we've got RGT. They've just been bought by Wahoo, and Wahoo has its own kind of training platform called System, which uses a methodology called 4DP. Okay, you might hear that sort of thrown around. Essentially, guys, what that is using peak powers. It's rider profiling. It's tracking your peak powers to kind of categorize you as a rider, categorize how well developed your different energy systems are. Okay, so 4DP is basically working with peak powers or critical powers, and RGT, however, is largely kind of FTP based. So like all the workouts, etc., are focused on percentage of FTP. So it's actually going to be super interesting. Well, maybe not super interesting, but interesting for likes of me at least. How those different two platforms are integrated, if they're integrated, and kind of what way they go with it. Because kind of FTP based training, training zone based training, because your training zones are set as a percentage of your FTP, they're not mutually exclusive. They do work together if you understand them properly. Okay, so that's kind of what I want to do this evening. Even if you're not interested in Wahoo System, learning about peak powers, their importance, how they interrelate with your training zones, it's just really important kind of training knowledge. Even if you're not really serious cyclist. Okay, so I think kind of our goal as cyclists, even if you're the most amateur of amateur cyclists, very little interest, is you want to maximize the productivity of your training time. Okay, even if you're just doing 1, 2, however many hours a week on the bike, you don't want it to be a waste of time. You want it to be improving your fitness, don't you? So this stuff is important to all levels, not just the super geeky cyclists and triathletes like me. All right, so even if you're not don't consider yourself a serious cyclist or triathlete, don't switch off, because this stuff will help you, I promise you. So yeah, we thought it would be helpful to work through this stuff, how it interrelates. They essentially can work together. One of the systems, some of the methodologies, will help you discover the areas in which you need to improve, and then the other will help you to kind of hit those right areas. Okay, so we're going to start off talking about peak powers. All right, so I've got charts, I'm afraid. I'll try to switch them on and off as quickly as possible, because it's not what you're kind of here for, I don't think, to stare at charts. But I'm just going to show you, not that one. I'm just going to show you. Sorry, it's really hard to do all this whilst you're you're cycling at the same time. Right, let's get rid of that. We'll get rid of that. That and that. There you go. Sessions are normally a little bit more seamless, but we'll just work with the situation that we're in. So this, guys, I'm not going to leave this up very long, but this is basically what you're going to be using your peak powers to kind of compare with. So these charts here, they basically indicate you basically use them to compare with your own powers to see where you sit in the hierarchy of cycling. Okay, so what you can see here is actually kind of the methodology that 4DP uses, that Wahoo system uses. Okay, so what you've got is different categorizations according to your FTP, your 5-minute power, 1-minute power, and 5-second power. And basically what that means is, you know, what is your best possible power that you can put out over these different time frames. And these are known, as I say, your peak powers or your critical powers. Okay, and so what you're essentially focusing on are kind of different energy systems, different changes in how you produce energy. Okay, that's why they're split into these different time frames, because each one will tell you a little bit about how your body works. Okay, so we actually with our athletes, we also track 20-second power. 4DP and this methodology don't track that. I'll mention that a little bit later, but there is a particular reason why we track 20 seconds as well, and I'll just let you in on that. So what you're looking to do with kind of peak powers is you're looking to kind of basically figure out, to test yourself, how good you are over these different durations and how much power you can produce over these different time frames, and then track them over time to assess progression and development of your different metabolic systems, your different energy systems, the way you produce energy. And each time frame, the FTP, 5-minute, 1 minute, 5 seconds, each one relates to a particular energy system, as I've explained. And also, as I'll explain later, falls within a different training zone. And so knowing how they fall could then help you improve the different peak powers by training in certain training zones. I hope that makes sense. That's kind of like the key message of the session, is if you know how your peak powers stack up, you can then use your training zones to kind of hit them and train in a certain way that will help to improve each of those peak powers, and ultimately become a more balanced rider if you're kind of improving all of them at the same time. So I hope that makes sense. So what we're looking at here, I'm just going to turn the chart off now, because it's not always the most interesting thing to stare at, nor am I suppose, but there you go. So we've got those kind of 4 peak powers. Let's start with the first one, which we're all familiar with. I imagine, your FTP. Okay, so there's various different ways of testing for it. You've got ramp tests, 20-minute tests, full spectrum performance testing like we use. But yeah, various different methods of testing it. But ultimately, what you're looking for is a power number that represents the maximum power you can hold for a full hour. Okay, and then the different testing methodologies, in my opinion, some are more accurate than others. I'm not going to go into that right now. If you're really interested, there's an article on our website called "Do You Really Know Your FTP?" and it explains kind of what FTP is and kind of how you test for it, along with some other useful knowledge. So head to our website, the training resources section on pretty much any page on our website is always there. There's a training article there about FTP. But basically, your 20-minute power, what you tend to do, you tend to test for that 20-minute power. You multiply it by 0.95, which then extrapolates it out as a prediction of what you can hold for that hour. Okay, so your FTP, remember, is meant to be the power that you can hold for a full hour. All right, so just remember that. And your FTP, if you're not aware, is a number that we try and put on what's called your aerobic threshold. Okay, so what that stands for, all that means is the point at which you go from kind of working with enough oxygen to help kind of, you know, keep you going, to working more and more in the absence of oxygen. Okay, this is a tipping point. All right, and that's what that FTP, that peak power, that 20-minute or 1 hour power, depending on how you're tracking it, that's what that peak power is there for. That shift in your metabolic systems from aerobic to more and more anaerobic. Okay, that's what your FTP is about. And then the next peak power is that 5-minute one. Okay, and similar to the FTP, your 5-minute power is used to kind of measure or to be illustrative of your VO2 max power. Okay, again, that's another kind of tipping point in how hard you work. As you work more harder and harder in terms of intensity, your body changes in the way it fuels that. And so your 5-minute power we use to kind of indicate how well developed your VO2 max is. Now, if you're not familiar with what VO2 max is, it's essentially kind of the max volume of oxygen that you can use during exercise. Okay, so once you go beyond that point, you're working predominantly anaerobically. Okay, it's a very important kind of metric for time trialists. You'll see them see videos of people in labs with masks on, etc., testing for that VO2 max, seeing how well developed it is. And it's a big genetic component to your VO2 max, so that's why you get freaks like Mathieu van der Poel, Marianne Vos, people like that, who just have outrageous natural VO2 maxes, and they can just do unreal things, recover and go again, because their powers, they have such a aerobic component to everything they do. So they've just got these huge, kind of proportionally huge lungs, or really efficient lungs maybe, you know. So that's why, guys, people like that, so good. So that's your 5-minute power. Next up is your 1-minute power. Okay, so the maximum power you can put out for a minute, and this is a good indicator of what's called your anaerobic capacity. And this means the total amount of work you can do in an anaerobic state before you need more and more aerobic energy production, more and more kind of oxygen-based energy production to kick in and help maintain the power. So it's just a full gas 1-minute effort, the sort of effort you do to kind of chase down a break, punch over a short climb in a race. Okay, and we're utilizing what's called your lactic acid system. So lactic acid is actually an energy source. It's lactate and hydrogen ions that are the waste products that we have to kind of recycle and get rid of. Okay, and you would have seen it. I think it was after the Tour of Flanders, Van der Poel was going on about how his legs were filled with lactate after the final time up the Quermont. And so you can see it's a very important energy system for guys like that, because ultimately how they can flush that lactate out, recover and go again, that can determine whether they win a race or lose it. Okay, so that's 1-minute power. And then the final kind of peak power or powers are your 5-second and as we use the 20-second power. Okay, so these kind of time frames, max effort sprints, are kind of measuring what's called your neuromuscular power. Okay, so basically translation, your top end or your max power, your max sprint power. Okay. And this is interesting because how well you do here will kind of indicate the type of blend of muscle fibers that you have. So if you're really naturally good at sprints, it will suggest that you have a high proportion of what are called fast twitch muscle fibers. The explosive muscle fibers, the ones that will lean on what's called your phosphocreatine system, which is the kind of explosive anaerobic energy system that power lifters and guys like Usain Bolt will use on a daily basis. So I'll just quickly go through that again because I know there's a lot of terminology, and ultimately our goal is to kind of cut through the terminology, but I do want you to be familiar with it because you'll see it coming up time and time again, particularly if you're a Wahoo RGT user and you start to kind of explore their other platforms, and as you get more experience this stuff comes up more and more. So what we talked about is your FTP. I think everyone's familiar with that one. I probably don't need to go down to that one again. Your 5-minute power, which is illustrative of your VO2 max. Your 1-minute power, which is illustrative of your air anaerobic capacity, the maximum work you can do in an anaerobic state. And then you've got 5 and 20-second power, which is your neuromuscular power, your maximum sprint. Okay. Now, once you've kind of collected data over those time frames, again, I'm not going to go into the testing because that's a whole nother talk in itself. But once you've collected data, and it doesn't have to be collected through testing, you can just collect it through workouts and racing over time. I think that's probably one of the really cool aspects of tracking your peak powers is like you don't have to test very often, because hopefully if you're doing the right kinds of workouts, you're going to be seeing progression in those numbers over time. So it's kind of a really good way of benchmarking you between testing sessions. Okay. And so and for some of our athletes, they might, particularly during the race season, they might go quite a long time without doing a testing session because we've got good data, we're collecting good data for them during their races, so we know what they're about, where they're up to, and we can compare the numbers that they're putting out in races to their peak powers and just kind of keep assessing them on an ongoing basis. But once you collected data over these time frames, what you can do is firstly see how you stack up in the scheme of things. So that's using, no, not that one, this chart. So that's using this, so you can see what you've got here. You might not be able to see it that well. This chart will be available on our website soon. But basically what you can do is get your powers for the different time frames and just see how you stack up. So, as an example, are you, the way the categories go is, are you novice, fair, moderate, good, very good, excellent, and basically you'll be able to gauge where you sit in the hierarchy. So different categorizations relate to different kind of levels of rider. So I think it's moderate, you'd be considered like a Cat 4 rider, and then just like that. Yeah, moderate, you'd be a Cat 4 level rider. If anyone does any bike racing, that will make sense to you. Good, you're Cat 3. Very good, Cat 2. Excellent, Cat 1. And then there are actually categories beyond that, but that means basically if you go beyond that, you're at a domestic pro level. So I can't imagine you have too many domestic pros joining tonight's session. So I didn't plan on going into that. But basically, once you've collected data for each of your peak powers, you can assess how you're categorized, and that will tell you kind of where you need work. If you are just if your categorizations are just low across the board, then you need to take a balanced approach. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, one of the kind of really useful instances is if someone's FTP and their 5-minute power is at a good level, but then their 5-second and 1-minute powers are at quite a poor level. It does indicate that there's quite an imbalance in their training, and there might be a reason for that. So for instance, long course triathletes, you know, they lean heavily on kind of their aerobic threshold. They might not do too much anaerobic work, but they still want to do some. And if that imbalance is too great, you know, it can limit their development as an athlete, which I will explain a touch more in a second. Just a quick drink of water. Don't worry guys, I will stop and just ask questions. I just want to get through the peak power stuff because that's kind of like the lion's share of the chat, and then I'll open it up for some questions. But hopefully a lot of that is making sense, or at least sounding familiar, or at least able to follow me. I hope. We'll see when we get the questions. As I say, once you've collected data for your FTP, 5-minute, 1-minute, 5 and 20-second powers, you can see how they stack up in the scheme of things, and also kind of how they sit proportionally to one another. Is one in a much higher category than the other, and you need to do work on that energy system which isn't sitting so well. But as I say, one of the common examples is with triathletes. They have a big FTP and 5-minute power because the two tend to be linked. Your FTP and your VO2 max tend to progress at a similar rate, but then their 1-minute and 5-second power is average, if not usually a pretty novice level. And even these long course triathletes don't want too much of an imbalance, because as you get deeper and deeper into a long endurance event, and this is actually a really important point guys, as you get further and further into a long endurance event, your slow twitch muscle fibers, your endurance muscle fibers that triathletes will rely on heavily, they will start to fade. And as your slow twitch muscle fibers fade, your fast twitch muscle fibers will have to become more and more active to pick up the slack. However, if they have zero conditioning, they're not going to be able to help for very long. And so, you know, that's why you often will see triathletes that do very little anaerobic work. As they get towards the end of a triathlon, they'll lose form, they'll just go off a cliff effectively. Okay, so it is important, even if you're the most endurance focused of endurance athletes, that you do at least some anaerobic work. And also, if you're doing anaerobic work, it will help pull up your FTP, because you're just building inherent strength, which is important for everybody. So you can see how your peak powers sit in this hierarchy, in these charts, will help you decide kind of where you need to focus in your training. Okay, and so this actually isn't a plug, because it will largely be free, but we're actually in the process of developing a project that will help you with these assessments, and help you determine how to adjust your training, and then that's where the plug comes. It will help you pick appropriate training plans and workouts to help assess, to help kind of address the areas that you need to develop. Okay, so that's peak powers, guys. You're working out your personal best power over different time frames. You're seeing how those numbers stack up in the whole hierarchy of cycling to get a categorization, and then you're seeing how the individual peak powers stack up against one another. Help see where you need to focus your training. I hope that makes sense. I'm just going to pause now and just open the floor for any questions I'll just quickly check the various chats. But guys, if any of that didn't make sense, or you'd like to repeat anything, please do say, because as I say, this stuff is kind of fundamental training knowledge. And don't worry if any of it is a bit over your head. Our goal really is to kind of introduce you to it and kind of help start to familiarise you with the jargon. So I'm just going to pause, have a drink and just chill out a second. Got any questions? Those guys on Zoom, remember you can just unmute yourself, or you can use the Zoom chat, or you can use the RGT chat, or if those guys following the live feed, just use the comment section and we'll pick those up. Okay, just give you a couple of minutes to type away or formulate any questions, otherwise we'll move on. Where have we gotten to? Well, I'm way behind. Wow, I'm good 2.5 Ks behind you guys now. Shows, particularly on a flat course like this, just shows you how effective it can be to ride as a group. Oh man, that is that is a lonely figure. But roughly you guys that are in the group, roughly halfway through. Yeah, just a quick reminder guys, if you're on Zoom, don't be afraid to ask questions. Your voice won't be going over the live stream. It'll just be within the Zoom meeting. I am mindful of the fact that typing is not always easy when you're riding, so do feel free to ask. Just give it another minute and then I'll move on. Yeah, it's a really good question there. Babayomi, hopefully I pronounced your name correctly. Apologies if I didn't. Yeah, so the question was, how does a rider determine the kind of cyclist they are, endurance, sprinter, climber? And basically, simply by doing these figuring out their peak powers, and then seeing how they sit in relation to one another will tell you what your phenotype is. And that's basically means time trialist, sprinter, all-rounder. Can't remember what the other phenotypes are. I think those are the three key ones. But that just comes down to the balance of your peak powers. Now, interesting one there about climber. Now, that kind of raises one of the limitations of this kind of profiling methodology. You've got the 4 peak powers, but that is a very kind of, well, 4-dimensional analysis of your capabilities. Really, in terms of kind of complete the picture, you want to be looking at various other things. Your climbing abilities is one of them, okay, and a really key one. So when we do kind of rider profiling, we look at the kind of the peak powers as like a really good kind of benchmarking system. But when we're profiling athletes, we will put them through other sessions. Okay, so we'll look at their climbing abilities over different types of climbs. We'll look at things like their speed endurance, their ability to repeat high-powered efforts. We'll look at we'll kind of go into kind of minutiae as well. you know, the VO2 max, your VO2 max power range is actually a really wide range. You're looking at efforts between 3 to 8 minutes, and I'll cover this a little bit more as we go through the training zones. But that's a really wide range. It's a long time difference. And so what we do sessions as well, which will assess how riders kind of which end of that they fare better at. So whether it's 3 minutes or towards the 8 minutes, in terms of their consistency of delivering power and just basically how high that power is. And that will just tell us kind of like how much of an aerobic component they really like, and whether you know, the kind of description you often get is whether someone's a diesel engine or a petrol engine. You know, and that's an example of a type of session that will kind of help assess whether somebody is a diesel engine or a petrol engine. Yeah, so that's a really good question. You know, you've got these peak powers, you've got these phenotypes, but ultimately it can be quite a narrow picture of an athlete. And so it's always really good to kind of test other things, in particular how good you are over at different climbs. And that can be super simple. Just pick 3 or 4 different climbs, set personal bests over them, and see what your power is like over them, how that matches up with the peak power categorizations. And yeah, then you just track. Then every now and then you do some hill rep sessions over the different climbs, and you can see how you progress over each of those different climbs. Okay, so great question, thanks very much. That really kind of, I think, helps to expand the topic there. So if there's any other quick questions, I'll just hold on a second. But then I'll go talk on about training zones, because the peak powers, they assess you. They're a good way of assessing you, but the training zones are a really good kind of resource to use to actually kind of address the things that come out of your peak power assessments. Okay, cool. Right, I just have to close the chat down a little bit so I can see my notes. So we're just going to talk about the training zones now. Okay, and this is perhaps terminology that most people are more familiar with. We tend to use the Coggan system, which is 7 training zones or power zones. Okay, let me just get another chart up, because actually this chart is useful to look at when I'm talking. So it's this one. Just close that down. So there, guys, this is a training zones chart. This again is available on our website. I think it's in the training article section. It might not be exactly this one, but there's a version of it. But basically, guys, once you've worked out where you need to improve, which energy systems you need to develop, working out that your training zones can really help you kind of address any of those issues. So I'm just going to quickly go through them, not to the same extent as the peak powers, but just very quickly rattle through them, and you can kind of, hopefully you can see the chart and follow along. But as I said, once you've gathered your peak powers, you can track them over time. You can then use these training zones to hone your training to improve those peak powers. Okay, so typically how they're broken down with the Coggan methodology is these 7 training zones. You can see on the left, you can see some familiar language there. You know, you look at zone 4 onwards, lactate threshold, your aerobic threshold, VO2 max, anaerobic capacity, neuromuscular power. So you can instantly see those peak powers have an application here. Okay, so hopefully that familiar language will help you kind of understand this a bit better as I go through. But it's just starting from the beginning, kind of zone 1, and this is actually a point I think helpful training tip even if you've not understood anything else in this session, knowing what zone 1 is actually super important. So it's really low intensity. You're talking an RPE, rate perceived exertion, a subjective kind of assessment of your effort should be 1 or 2 out of 10. 10 being a full-on sprint. And then you'll see kind of in the penultimate column on the right, it's less than 55% of FTP. So if you're riding now on this New Forest loop and you're wanting it as a active recovery session, your power right now should be less than 55% of FTP. Otherwise, if it's just above, you're going to be not working hard enough to get a training stimulus, but then working too hard to recover optimally. Okay, so one to remember for next time, you're joining this session as an active recovery session, you want that power to stay under 55% of FTP. Then we get to zone 2. This is where the majority of your training will be spent. So 3 or 4 out of 10 effort. You're talking sort of 56 to 75% of FTP. It's where you spend most of your time on your long endurance rides. It's cruising effort, where you're utilizing a greater percentage of fat for energy and sparing your precious glycogen stores that quickly get depleted as you increase the intensity. Basically, glycogen, storage form of glucose, it's very quick to metabolize. Fat, we have basically unlimited stores even for the leanest person, but it's much slower to metabolize. So the lower intensity, you'll use more fat. Higher intensity, you'll use more glycogen or glucose. They're the same thing, glycogen and glucose. Glycogen is a storage form. Okay, and that gets depleted much more quickly if you're at higher intensity. Okay, so that's zone 2. That's your cruising level. That's your long weekend mileage type of effort. Zone 3, not area, it's a little bit of a no man's land, but actually is utilised a lot in racing. Okay, if you look at kind of power numbers after a race, tempo is kind of like a strong 5 or 6 out of 10 effort, where you actually tend to spend a lot of your time when you're racing. It's still using a large degree of fat for energy, but you are starting to use more and more glycogen. Okay, as we creep towards that aerobic threshold, which takes us to zone 4. Now this is where your peak powers start to creep in. Okay, so zone 4 is where you'll find your FTP, that aerobic threshold. Okay, where your 20-minute extrapolated out, or your 1 minute pure power. Okay, here you're using a lot more glycogen for energy and much less fat. Okay, when you go beyond this training zone, this 91 to 105% of FTP, you're going to start to work more and more anaerobically. Okay, more and more in the absence of oxygen. All right, so that's a 7 to an 8 out of 10 effort. And one thing you also see in this chart is the description. If you don't have a power meter on your bike, that description will help you kind of gauge your effort. So you'll see for a threshold, it's a hard effort, you're unable to talk, and it's kind of that when you're on the edge that I think we're probably all familiar with. Okay, so that's zone 4. Zone 5 is where that 5-minute power comes in, that VO2 max power. Okay, as I said earlier, this power range, 106 to 120% of FTP, actually encompasses kind of efforts that you can hold for 3 minutes up to about 8 minutes. So it's very broad. Okay, but this is where that 5-minute power sits. The maximum volume of oxygen you can use during exercise. As we kind of mentioned above, that 5-minute power is illustrative of how well developed your VO2 max is. In terms of effort, it's a solid 9 out of 10. Horrible place to sit. Absolutely hate it. But it's a really important metric. and a really important training zone. So if you want to improve that 5-minute power, you're pretty much doing full gas efforts over 3 to 8 minutes in order to improve that 5-minute power. And you wanted to kind of hit a range of different time frames within that. Okay, so that's zone 5. Zone 6, we'll come into the purely anaerobic stuff. 10 out of 10 effort, pretty much, or known as like a long sprint. So this is kind of 30 seconds to that 3-minute area. Okay, and if we correlate to the peak powers, we use that 1-minute power that sits within the zone 6, and we use that to gauge total work that you can do in an anaerobic state. Okay, when you're in this zone 6 doing these long sprints, you're using that lactic acid system, remember, and you're working pretty much entirely anaerobically. Okay, using that, just smashing straight through those glycogen stores, using very little fat for energy. Okay, so that's the penultimate training zone. 30 second to 3-minute efforts, full gas. Final one is that less than 30 seconds effort, full on short sprint, everything you got, turning yourself inside out. Okay, that's your max level sprint, your neuromuscular power, utilizing what's called your phosphocreatine system, that system that powerlifters use. Okay, now 4DP, as I said right at the start, the system that Wahoo system uses, really unhelpfully repetitive language there, doesn't track 20-second power, but typically you use the 20-second effort to test for your 5-second power. So we track 20-second power for our athletes as well, because it's a really good, useful metric to compare with your 5-second and your 1-minute power to see kind of how your sprint drops off. So if you're a crit racer or a road racer, you need that finishing sprint. It's actually really good to track your 20-second power as well, because you might have a world-ending, world-class 5-second power, but depending on how rapidly that drops off between 5 and 1 minute, you can start to gauge kind of what your sprint endurance is like, how long you can hold like a really good power for, because it matters. Because if you sprint too early, the wheels are going to come off before you can make the finish line. And so it becomes increasingly important the kind of more serious you become. But yeah, you really want to be able to make sure you don't go too early, or alternatively, if you can, your 5-second power might not be world ending, but by God, you can hold a high power for a long time. You want to go from further out, you want to go from that 1 kilometer mark, that 500 meter mark, while everyone else is just holding on until they get to within 200 meters. So SUCCOM has a real kind of context specific application once you kind of build the knowledge and build kind of your understanding of your own kind of powers and your own characteristics as a rider. So guys, that's kind of what I wanted to discuss this evening. I'll just quickly summarize what we talked about, so hopefully it kind of distills some of the knowledge that we talked about and you can kind of take some of this away. But just remember, if you're watching this live, guys, this video, the video from this, will be available for a week or so, because as this session just demonstrated, I'm too disorganized to get it down any quicker than that. So you will be able to rewatch this if anything you've kind of only got half a grasp of it. I want to go back and watch it. So you just head to our Facebook page and it will be up there, or you can head to the Be Cycling News social media channels and it'll be up on one of their social channels. Okay, so you can go back and rewatch this if you really want. But this stuff is so important to know, even if you're not super serious, because it can help you maximize your training time. If you have very little time to train, and I don't really know anybody, you get a lot of people say they don't care, they just train for exercise or to stay fit, But none of us want to stand still, do we? We want to improve. You know, we, particularly if our mates do this stuff as well, you know, we want to be able to compete with them. And that actually is kind of the main premise behind our the project that I mentioned earlier that we're working on to help people understand this stuff, assess it and make decisions. One of the things we want people to be able to do is see how they stack up against their mates. And because that can, we're all very good at competing when it comes to race day and getting motivated for that, but I think it'd just be highly motivating to know that your mate has a 1 minute power that's 20 watts higher than yours. Firstly, if you're not interested in racing, that's something to train for. You want to kick your mate's ass. So, even if you're not super serious, this stuff can really matter, can help you maximize what little time you do have to train. And if you're concerned about how to track this stuff, there's various platforms you can use. Training Peaks is the obvious one. We've mentioned Golden Cheetah a lot, which is a free but less user-friendly platform. Strava has a version. I've never really used the Strava one, so I'm not too familiar with it. And then of course you've got Wahoo system and the 4DP methodology. But just remember, these peak powers, it's kind of one side of the picture. There's various other things you want to look at as well. But I'll just quickly run through what we talked about. So we talked about the peak powers. Okay, 5 second. We'll start from the other end. FTP, which is your 1 hour power, but we usually test over 20 minutes and then extrapolate it out. Got your 5 minute power, representative of your VO2 max. Okay, the maximum volume of oxygen you can use. Your 1 minute power, illustrative of your anaerobic capacity, the amount of work you can do whilst in the anaerobic state. Then you've got your 5 or your 20-second power, max effort sprint. Okay, everything you've got. So you can use those powers, track them over time, see how you fare in this chart, see how you're going, how you stack up. You can also see how your different peak powers sit proportional to one another. Are you more of a time trialist with a high FTP and 5 minute power? Are you more of a crit racer that's perhaps got more of an all-round, well-balanced profile? You know, or are you a proper sprinter? You know, your 5 second, 1 minute power is really good. Or perhaps another way of putting that one, or your 5 second and 1 minute power is quite good, but you just don't have a very good endurance base, and so your FTP is a lot lower than it should be. You know, any of those kind of imbalances or balances will tell you something about who you are as a rider. Okay, so that's the peak powers. You can use that to assess who you are as a rider, and then you can use the training zones, this old doodah, to kind of use it to help you focus your training. You know, those peak powers all sit within different training zones, which roughly correlate to different changes in your energy production. Okay, and then you can start doing sessions that focus in on specific training zones. So you can do VO2 max focus session, you can do sprint sessions, you can do time trialing focus sessions that are sitting at and around your FTP. You know, you can very quickly put together a half decent training plan just through gauging your peak powers and then working out your training zones and using that. As I say, guys, we're working on a project that will really help you with this. So I'm not quite sure when it's going to be ready. Still quite a lot to do. It will start out being pretty basic, but eventually, hopefully, be extremely useful. So just keep an eye out on our social media for that. And I'm hoping next few weeks, but it may well take longer because there's a lot of inputs to it. So yeah, if you don't follow us already, follow us on social media at RIAK.fitness, or you can keep checking our website RIAK.fitness, because I think hopefully particularly the guys that use Wahoo RGT regularly, it'll be a really useful resource. So yeah, guys, that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. I hope there were some good takeaways. I hope you're able to follow all that. If you weren't, please hit me with your questions now. I'll stick around to answer them. But otherwise, guys, really well done on the course. I've still got about 11 Ks to go, but looks like the rest of you that are well ahead, you've got probably less than half of that to go. But yeah, I'll just pause now in case anybody's got any questions. Don't worry if you're not super confident answering questions in these sessions, guys. I personally, you may not believe it because I do this sort of thing, but when I get in a group setting, I can be quite shy and I'm always very nervous about asking questions. So don't worry about it, guys. If you're not comfortable, do remember you can always email us after the session or drop us a line on social media. If it's a very long answer, we might just cover it in the next session, or if it's a quick answer, we'll respond to you directly. I mean, we'll always respond to you, but whether we answer your question in full, we might do in the next session or in response. But that's the hour, guys, so I'm going to drop away in a second unless anyone's got any last questions. Apologies for the technical issues at the start of the session. I was technically the issue, is perhaps more accurate. But hopefully it wasn't too shambolic. Otherwise, guys, feel free to stay on the course for as long as you want if you've got a little while to go. And just enjoy yourself. As always, guys, if anyone has any particular topics that they'd like us to discuss in these sessions, please do send us an email or again on social media. We do love doing sessions that are into response to people's questions. So alongside doing this session because of the Wahoo RGT merger, I also wanted to do this session because somebody asked me a good question the other day, which kind of was a light bulb in my head that we should probably do a session on this. So do feel free to send us some questions. We might have done the topic already, but we may well be able to kind of come at it from a different angle. So there you go, guys. I will disappear now unless anyone's got any last minute questions. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed that, guys. So on our training resources area, you can you'll find loads of kind of sessions like this, shorter sessions, our know-how series. You'll also find training articles, and then if you want more sessions like this where you have a workout to go along with a coach talking you through a particular subject in depth, we have 3 series of these types of sessions called our cycle seminars, and you can rent those, and each session comes with a low intensity workout, so you can build a lot of knowledge whilst training. So head to the on-demand section on our website and you'll be able to see what we've got to offer. But otherwise, guys, I'll drop off there. Thanks so much for your company this evening. Thanks for the questions, and I look forward to seeing you on a session soon where my technical skills are up to scratch. Well done, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.